Hi, I'm Robin and I'm part of the Creative Bureaucracy Festival team. And I'm very happy to have with me here today, at least virtually, Dan Hill, who is a designer and urbanist with many strings to his bow. But today we're going to be focusing on his role as the Director of Strategic Design at Vinnova, which is the Swedish government's innovation agency. And more specifically, we're going to be looking at the idea of mission-oriented innovation in practice through the lens of a Swedish street. So, Dan, I'll hand over to you to take us through what you've been working on.
Thank you, Robin. Thanks for inviting me here to talk about this. I'm going to talk about a project we're doing to do with streets here in Sweden, in a sense, but much wider issues to do with how do we do this kind of systemic change and mission-oriented innovation. If that rings any bells as well. So if you can see the slides, give me a nod. There we go, great. So as Robin said, I'm the Director of Strategic Design at Vinnova. I have an affiliation with UCL as well, where I work with Mariana Mazzucato's institute there. And Vinnova, just so people know, is the Swedish government innovation agency. So we're responsible for the making sure the country's innovation systems are fit for purpose. And we are, in our role is that we're prototyping a couple of areas in a mission-oriented innovation way, healthy, sustainable mobility and healthy, sustainable food. And right away, you can kind of see we're taking this principle about saying, how does mobility generate outcomes well beyond mobility, if we put it that way? So well beyond traffic, as in mobility is not really about traffic, it's about some other outcome, community, commerce, conviviality, those kinds of things. And how do we do that in a way that generates health outcomes and sustainability outcomes, rather than being driven by the traditional sort of transport planning measures of flow of optimization of traffic or things like that. So we started off in these areas by actually doing a huge sort of participative exercise. And we worked directly with stakeholders, which sometimes people feel is awkward place to start, because stakeholders are sometimes associated with lobbyists or sort of the PR agencies of large corporations and so on. Actually, we're trying to get to the front line of the mobility systems in this case. We did the same with food. And so we talked with public transport operators in Sweden. We talked with micro-mobility startups like Move by Bike or Voi, scooter companies, cargo bike companies. We talked with Volvo, big car companies and truck companies and so on. But also regional health operators, national level of government, local level of government, third sector, and so on. And we put them all in the room at the same time. We call this kind of a system in the room workshop. And we work through where would you begin to intervene in these systems? Where are the kind of acupuncture points? Out of that come a few sort of starting points. If you go to the system and do this, let's say repeatedly, we did 300 or 400 organizations last year in this way, all over Sweden. You start seeing some patterns emerging as to where to intervene. And we can start thinking of this as kind of a system of touch points. Where could we begin to produce innovation in a place-based way? In places, we can keep systems complex, but they're also entirely everyday and they're surrounding us all the time. People know what streets are, they know what retail and shopping is, even if we understand that it's changing fundamentally. Retail, of course, is changing because of e-commerce and many other things. So it's an incredibly interesting area to look at mobility through, as is lower density environments like villages or ex-urban conditions, or the idea of how you might make regional grids underpinning electricity or for mobility one way or another. But the street is kind of where things converge. It's where all systems converge in a way. It's where it's almost like I call it the basic unit of city. It's the thing that surrounds us all the time. It's hugely contested. And yet we've largely been running it in a very kind of monolithic way for about 50, 60 years because of the dominance of car-based mobility and so on. Other cities around the world are, of course, doing really interesting work, beginning to move the car out, or rather beginning to rebalance at least the mobility systems to create space for greenery and conviviality and community. Paris's 15-minute city strategy, I think, is the kind of sets the bar for this at the moment, is the exemplar project in this sense. But Oslo are doing the same thing. Helsinki, likewise. You can see Barcelona with the Superblocks project is giving something like 70% of its streets back to people, it's called, as opposed to cars. So these are quite profound shifts. And what we're trying to do in Sweden and then say that every street in the country needs to be healthy, sustainable, and vibrant, as in health producing rather than health reducing, as in can we make streets which enable people to be healthier as opposed to unhealthy, or making people unhealthy? And how do we make them sustainable, as in zero carbon, non-polluting, not putting problematic substances in water that flows off the street and so on. And vibrant as in full of life. And that life, just to be clear, could be busy city life on a Friday night, or it could be just full of birds and butterflies, it's fine, and tomato plants and so on. They're both full of life in different ways. So we talk about the street in that sense. And that means shifting what the street is optimized for. And on the left-hand side of this funny diagram, you see, in a way, I'm seeing that the street really has been run by the traffic department. It's sort of been given over to them, say, this is your province. And so the output of the traffic department is really traffic. The clue is in the name one way or another. You tend to get these quite one-to-one relationships like this. And it's not that they don't understand sustainability and health and so on. It's just that they're traditionally optimized around traffic-like measures one way or another. And their planning tools are based around those things, and the cultures likewise. It's seen as sort of an engineering problem. Whereas we could see the street, and the right-hand side here is actually containing many, many more inputs. So think of it like a fan almost that you could open up and say we could put public health into that, we can put sustainability and resilience, we can put commerce and community, all of those things. And traffic is one of the things that goes into it then, but it's really not the most important. We don't make the street to make traffic. So we make it to make commerce and conviviality and community and so on. So the outputs, you see down the bottom of the fan, flowing through this thing called the street, can be equally diverse. So this is a very basic idea, but that's why, going back a step, we put the system in the room in these workshops and work it through. And ask this question about then, what are the priorities here? If you give the street to traffic engineers, you give traffic. If you give the street to gardeners, you get gardens one way or another. So can we use the street to produce significant environmental quality, or increase well-being, or increase biodiversity? Those are the kind of things that we need to produce outcomes around now. So we're looking at making a kind of what we call a value model behind this, looking at the benefits, the co-benefits of those things. The research sits underneath all of this stuff. If I show this, if you imagine a street, the amount of things that it could do is extraordinary. Reduce maintenance costs, reduce stormwater, urban heat island effect. It could decrease domestic violence. You can increase social fabric. You can increase children's social mobility. Of course, you can increase public health through active transport. You can reduce carbon, all of these things. You can increase the value of footfall and therefore shops on the street. All of those things the street can do. But all that research sits in silos, and it tends to be operationalized through silos. So that rarely comes together as one thing. So what we're doing here, and again, don't worry about the detail, just imagine doing this as one thing. Seeing the street as a holistic transdisciplinary object, which is kind of what it is, what I'd call like an everyday complex object, and work on the street's terms, really. And what that also enables us to do is a different logic around scaling. So instead of, let's say, on the left-hand side, a traditional urban development project, a hugely innovative one like the River City project in Gothenburg, which is huge, one of the biggest in Europe, still only changes the middle bits of the city one way or another. Whereas if we look at all the streets in Gothenburg, that's the image on the right, and come up with a logic for changing them, it's far more powerful in that sense. And in fact, there's about 40,000 kilometers of street in Sweden, which is about 600 square kilometers, which is like 6 times the size of Paris. So accessing that layer, addressing the layer of street, is suddenly the biggest urban development project in Europe. You see it like that. But how do we then change all of the streets, but start small? And this is then the practice things. You don't get to change all of the streets. You can't just flip the switch, no matter the fact that they're all run by the same law. They're all run very differently in reality. And of course, they're different in Gothenburg to Malmö to Stockholm to Umeå to Helsingborg. So we're coming up with then a modular approach to this, and we're working with multiple partners here right away as well to make sure that the system itself is changing. This isn't something Vinnova is doing. It's something that we're facilitating and gluing together, but actually it's being done by municipalities, regions, all kinds of different government agencies. But this modular kit emerged as an idea like this, which has then been translated by industrial designers working with ArcDes, the National Center for Architecture and Design, into a kit of parts, which is almost like an IKEA-like or Lego-like extensible system. you can begin to kind of thread these together, almost like we call this like a boardwalk, but it's almost imagine like a concertina, and you can expand or contract this. And then crucially, when it comes to what happens on the streets, we're coming up with a model for participation at that level. So the first streets to be redesigned have been designed by school kids. We picked streets by schools, where the schools basically empty out onto the street. And we've let the kids themselves design what happens there, coming up with very basic, simple kits for designing, like little bits of paper with options on them, and they choose. We've also done with this with the Prime Minister, by the way. There's the Swedish Prime Minister, Stefan Löfven, and I won't tell you who's better at this, the school kids or him. He was actually very good at seeing the outcomes, but perhaps the kids are better designers for their street. And this is a basic principle. Who better to design the street than the residents and users of the street? This can't be done by experts from outside. Experts can make sure that they're safe and the regulations are being observed, but actually what happens there, the participation model, this is kind of the big change in planning culture, should be done by the residents and users themselves wherever possible. And this enables diversity to happen because every street is different. Therefore, you have different designs for every street, as opposed to the same design across every street. Same design across every street is efficient, but again, we don't make cities to be efficient. In fact, most of the amazing things about cities are not about efficiency at all. So when kids put a fake palm here or a fountain or a sandpit, that's not about efficiency. But of course, that's entirely what the street can be about. So this is where it goes into reality in the last couple of weeks. These are some of the first streets in Stockholm we're looking at. You can see the schools in the background, some of them. But these are typical streets. There are thousands of these all over the country, and I'd argue all over Europe, and they're being used largely as parking spaces, which is, yes, it generates some money for the municipality, but it's really about being paid for by climate change. So it's not really the best use of this space for multiple reasons. Those kids' designs get turned into kind of vaguely coherent plans by planners at White Architecture and Spacescape and Stockholm Stad, the municipality, working together there. And then Lundberg Design, again, working with ArcDes, and us in the background helping coordinate, then creating this kit of parts which fits into those things. So this idea, again, is inspired a bit like the boardwalk, again, that enables you to really claim space in this fast-moving kind of flow that you can't usually get into. And then they're made of wood, which is softening the landscape of the street, which then asks questions about what are the materials of the street? Why are they concrete? We know why for efficiency reasons, but again, that's not really a good reason at the end of the day. So Swedish timber being manufactured to make this kind of cost-effective and bespoke using new methods of construction. This is appearing in the newspapers last week, and then this is it being launched on Thursday. So the first bits of this include some of these kind of trampolines and so on. And you can see what happens when the kids get on a trampoline, of course. But then these are the modular elements, which are beginning to offer different applications in previously what was a parking space. And you can only really do one thing with a parking space, theoretically, is put a car in it. But in reality, it's just a space in the city. It doesn't say you have to put a car in it. So in the background on the right, you can see a BMX track, basically, for scooters, or some seating and bike racks and scooter stands. There's some school kids having their food on it. And these, again, are the school kids that designed it. And this is also solving the scooter parking problem, of course, and bike parking. And then the broader project has these other elements in it, like soft play areas, sand pits, and so on, swings. And you see how this kind of boardwalk kind of fits in and begins to kind of give an alternate surface to the street. And crucially, from a systemic design point of view, we had this layer strategy, like a platform strategy, understanding that the blue bit at the top here is distinct to those streets. So those streets are designed in a particular way because of climate and people and the functionality required. But underneath that, you can be very consistent in terms of policy and finance and law, and those things can spread across the country, potentially even Europe. So therefore, we've lined up our partners along those different things. So we have the Transport Regulatory Authority that really holds the parking space law as a partner in the project. And you would never usually get that in, when you're designing 4 streets in the middle of Stockholm. That's just done by the municipality. But here we're making sure that those 4 streets have the whole DNA of the system behind them so that we can then scale it out from there. So we're working with Stockholm now, but also Umeå and Helsingborg and Malmö and others and enable, and big cities and small cities that enable us to scale, and then the multiple bits of the system. So I'll just close by just then talking about these kind of core principles. So the decision making is really key. So who decides what the street is about? The street itself, essentially, by which I mean, in this case, the residents and the users of the street. And they can adopt this kit and adapt it. So if they come up with better ideas for what happens there, that falls back into the kits of parts, basically, that the state can own and then make available to other cities, other streets to adopt and adapt. Within that, there's lots of questions. What's the idea of landscape here? There's a lovely installation that ARC does at the moment by the Australian artist Linda Tagg called Infield, which is about meadows, basically, and biodiversity. And, could the street have this kind of biodiversity? And these are planters, but they don't sit in the kind of formal square planter boxes we usually have in streets. It's something far more biodiverse, actually. Much more useful in many ways, but also more beautiful, more engaging, and requires participation and so on. It really reverses the logic of planting, not about efficiency, but about many other things. So could we begin to explore these ideas in the street? And of course, this year's events through COVID kind of clearing the streets, and then Black Lives Matter filling the streets, have shown really what the street is about, that it's actually about politics as well. It's about places to play out new ideas for what we're about. So I'll just close on that thought that really, while I'm super applauding Paris's 15-minute city strategy, and I think it's a model for basically almost every city in different ways. I'm also interested in the 1-minute city, the immediate city outside your front door, your apartment block, whatever, and your relationship with that, and creating a very participative and engaged thing there in terms of the dynamics. So it's those traditional things that we try to get out of the way because of efficiency, like creating a demand for care and maintenance and repair, but from the residents themselves, we actually put in on purpose to create completely different relationships between you and the ownership of the space. So the street is the great example of this kind of shared space, complex shared space. So it enables us to prototype these new ways of making decisions together accordingly. I'll leave it at that. And then, Robin, look forward to your incredibly hard questions. And thank you.
Yeah, Dan, thank you so much for that. It's having heard about the project now a few months ago, to see it finally taking shape is incredibly exciting. And I'm hoping, and that leads me to my first question, that similar stuff can happen across other countries, both in Europe and the broader world. But my, therefore, first question to you is, how unique do you think this is to Sweden as a country, or specifically to Sweden having Vinnova there as the government innovation agency? What are those conditions replicable across all countries, do you think? And what crucially role does Vinnova specifically play in enabling that to play out?
Yeah, I think the first part of your question is that these things are happening across other cities and countries, of course, and in both strategic and tactical ways, and both are kind of fine in a way. The tactical stuff, where I'd say that and this is the second part of your question, where the public sector and the governance is not so engaged and it's being done almost as a sort of activism, I think that's incredibly powerful, but may not change the system. And so as we saw, in early COVID days, bike lanes were popped up in Berlin very quickly, sort of a fraction of the time it usually takes, which was, for me, fantastic, because I'm generally in favor of anything that begins to move the street into other possibilities. But at the same time, we've seen that then there have been an increase in cyclist deaths in Berlin because the trucks weren't moved out of the way. So unless the system changes, the tactical stuff can't do that by itself. Citizens can do a lot, and they should. And we need to make space for that to happen. But then the responsibility for the state side is to figure out, well, how do we make this a systemic change? And that's where Vinnova maybe comes in, or like an entity like us. And you could do this at a municipal level or a state level like us. But an entity that can be the glue between all of these disparate parts, that can hold the idea while it's still an idea, kind of hold the question in your hand before it's sort of allocated to someone in the system in terms of a silo, and hold it in a multidisciplinary way between multiple agencies, and then glue them together as we did with those workshops I showed at the start, and then continually get people on board with this and hold it until it's in reality. And then the municipalities can run it. There's no way that we need to be involved at that point, except to learn from it. But it's this kind of classic problem about what do you do with problems that are no single person's responsibility? And so they fall in between the cracks there. And unfortunately, the things falling between the cracks are the climate crisis, public health crisis, and social justice.
Yeah.
So the biggest challenges we have somehow fall between the cracks of our system. So you need a thing that can stand there and glue it together and initiate it as a project so that people can then experience it. Then I think it can run. So yeah, that's where I think of Vinnova or equivalent. It doesn't have to be anything like us in particular, but that role is super important.
And in terms of that role then, as an initiator of those kind of projects, like what sort of reaction initially do you get from, say, the local municipalities who are used to running streets in a certain way, or people who have no experience of collaborating in the ways that you have been? Yeah, how do they perceive the project? How have you been getting them on board?
Stubbornness. It's variable reactions. Obviously, some people in the municipality are all for this, and we've been lucky with Stockholm. There was a Vice Mayor Daniel Hildén who is already leading some initiatives to transform streets, like a summer streets program we had running here, where some streets in the summer had cars removed and other things put in place and so on, or rather slowed the traffic. So we're able to build on a kind of a bedrock of some people in municipalities. You can always find someone that's trying to do something like this. But of course, we get the complete opposite as well, which is in a way, almost a threat to the power relationship, and saying, if the street's not about traffic, what is it about? That's uncertainty and ambiguity, and people don't tend to like that. So you have to kind of make that manageable by making it concrete and helping them. And then the second thing is, it's very much to do with power relationships, because traffic agencies are very powerful things. We've given them huge responsibility in a way. And so any sense that might be removing their power, no matter, even if you can say this is achieving national priorities and the UN Sustainable Development Goals and so on, it still comes down to people and relationships and power at the end of the day. So those things have to be negotiated through very carefully. And so a lot of diplomacy required, a lot of comfort with handling uncertainty and ambiguity. And then maybe there's an art also of sort of pulling things together and making them concrete and tangible, and trying to get to this point that I just showed you, kids on a trampoline in the street, as soon as possible. Because if you can get to that point, it's very hard to deny. You're going to say, okay, kids, we're going to take your trampoline away. And that's not really a message that anybody wants to get behind, I suspect. So as quick as possible to the prototype, and let that handle the decision making.
And you touched on it a little bit there, but I'm interested to know your opinion on what kind of rethinking do we need in terms of training, and for people across the board. So obviously not just people like yourself in that facilitator or sort of diplomatic role in the middle, but like also for people who are designing the transport systems, or who maybe are on the policy side. Like, are there any common grounds that we need to cover and taking more of a horizontal approach, perhaps, that we don't currently?
That is a book-length topic, Robin.
Perhaps maybe a smaller question. Where have you seen this done well in relation to the project that you're currently working on?
Yeah, and I'm not trying to dodge the question, because it's just that the answer is so, I think, challenging. We're talking about a 180-degree shift in policymaking practice and delivery practice. So it's really practice-based, evidence-led, rather than data-driven, evidence-led. Never mind non-evidence-based decision-making, which most policymaking is. It's a facility with empathy and uncertainty and ambiguity. Some of those things are kind of wrapped up in design practice, of course, which is what my background is, but it's not exclusive to design at all. You can get that from other disciplines too. There's an ability to rethink the question, to reframe the question, absolutely, and say, so what, again, if you look at the street as a street and don't question what it's about, then you make traffic. But if you can question the outcomes you can pull out of that thing, then that's a very powerful skill that policymakers aren't often given the choice of that, or they're not trained to do that. They don't think that's possible. The relationship of politicians to policymakers, that's also complicated and complex. So really, we're heading to something which is far more collaborative, participative. It's working in more agile, fluid ways. I'm in danger of hitting many buzzwords here. It is highly about this. How can we live in the projects themselves and use those to generate evidence as we go, and therefore build policy around those things, those insights from the front line, as you were, which requires a far more than agile adaptive capability. So you can change course as you go and learn from it and build policy and regulation around it, as opposed to the other way around, this kind of a priori guess about what needs to happen that we write into law and then initiate policy and then deliver, and then only then do you find that it might not be the right thing. So that's what I mean by the 180 degree shift. So yeah, I think a lot of retraining for sure, but also an awareness, just that awareness that we are in the midst of a transformational shift, and that's something that we have to drive from within if we can.
And I think what's really nice about the approach, I mean, the fact that you're working on the streets is getting the kids involved from such a young age in something that, as you say, is like completely tangible, by default brings that awareness, and they'll grow up being aware of and being actively engaged in those projects. So hopefully that mindset will just by default be part of their everyday experience.
I hope so. I mean, we're also doing another project with school food, which has a similar kind of agenda, I guess, around sustainability and health, and just the idea that you might get kids involved in menu creation or growing food or understanding food or cooking with the chefs and understanding where food comes from and how it affects your health, all of those things. Yeah, I mean, getting that into a 7-year-old or a 12-year-old, and of course you hope that that might shift the way they think about food and they later make more sustainable choices or healthier choices. I'm not assuming that, because things change when you grow, as you know, but that seems like the best possible start. And a lot of the people that I work with that I find very inspiring in different ways, I often find there was something in their childhood that turned them into this, or turned them onto that in some way. Though they said, oh yeah, and then I made this, I made this chicken farm in the street when I was 8 years old, and now I've become urban agriculture,
Totally. No, it's
so yeah, so we are trying to kind of get that into them at the earliest possible stage. But you could also do this with 80-year-olds. So to me, your answer to your question, yes, kids for sure, but 80, if that street had an aged care home on it and not a school, then you design it with the 80-year-olds, and that changes their perspective about what the street and the city or the environment can be about.
I would honestly love to go on asking you questions for the rest of the day. Sadly, we're running out of time, but I wanted to ask you if there's one thing or a couple of things that you could leave for people to take away with them in terms of where they could look next if they're interested to explore more these kind of ideas of either mission-oriented innovation in practice, or more specifically the street work that you're working on.
Yeah, I mean, the street work we're just launching last week, those photos were from Thursday. So, and this is now, whatever it is, Tuesday, Monday. You lose track in Zoom time, don't you? But so keep an eye on that, because that's just now beginning to emerge, and it's sort of emerging in the Swedish press, but we'll broadcast it fairly heavily. And the idea is really that we're making that as an open source kit of parts, really. So it is literally something we would love other cities to adopt and adapt and make their own and critique and build upon and so on. So that's our intent with that. So absolutely get in touch with me or watch that space. And then the broader questions you asked about policymaking practice or practice of public sector, I think UCL, again, the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, and Mariana's work there, and the Masters of Public Administration, which I'm co-teaching one of the modules on, that's led by Mariana, that gets into what is this new culture of acting in the public sector. So that would be a place to look at new practice developing in that sense, in terms of retraining and reframing thinking. And then our street stuff, yes, look on the ground to see what that might mean in practice.
Brilliant. Well, we'll make sure our side that we put links to all of the things that you've just mentioned in the notes on the website. And yeah, I can only thank you for joining us today. Also for the other session, make sure everybody catches that as well, because that's a very interesting conversation with Dan. And yeah, have a lovely rest of your day.
Great. Thank you, Robin. Great to talk. Thank you.